The hotel receptionist's smile faltered as she looked from the reservation screen to the group standing in front of her. "I'm so sorry," she said. "There was a booking error." Asher Quinn barely looked up from his phone. "Fine," he replied evenly. "Just give me whatever room is available." She swallowed. "We only have one room left." A few co-workers groaned, expecting someone to draw the short straw. Then she continued. "And it has one king-sized bed." The lobby went silent. "Asher Quinn," she said cautiously. "You'll be sharing with Kieran Vale." For one suspended heartbeat, neither man moved. Then laughter erupted from every direction. "Oh, this is going to be entertaining. They'll kill each other before breakfast. I give them 2 hours." Kieran ran a hand through his dark hair and forced a crooked smile that fooled everyone except Asher. "Guess fate has a strange sense of humor." Asher slipped his phone into his pocket. "I'll take the couch." The receptionist winced. "There isn't one." "I'll sleep on the floor," Kieran offered immediately. "No." The answer left Asher's mouth before he thought about it. Kieran blinked. "You don't have to. I'm not letting you sleep on hardwood." For a brief second, their eyes locked. It was the same look that had happened dozens of times during late-night presentations and impossible deadlines. A look neither of them ever acknowledged. Long enough to notice, short enough to deny. Someone behind them whistled. "Look at that. They're already negotiating like an old married couple." The teasing broke the moment. Asher picked up his overnight bag and headed toward the elevator, without another word. Kieran followed. Neither noticed they had fallen into step with one another. Their room overlooked the mountains, where dark clouds rolled over the peaks like slow-moving waves. Thunder rumbled somewhere in the distance. Inside, the room was immaculate. One suitcase landed beside the wardrobe, then the second. One bed stood in the center. Neither man looked directly at it. Instead, they busied themselves unpacking, careful to leave an invisible line between their belongings, as though a few inches of space could keep 3 years of unresolved tension from spilling into the room. "You can have the left side," Kieran said quietly. "I'm fine with either." "You always say that." Asher glanced over. "What?" "That you're fine." Kieran gave a faint smile. "Even when you obviously aren't." The words caught Asher off guard. No one at the office had ever noticed. Or perhaps no one had cared enough to. Before he could answer, another roll of thunder echoed through the mountains, rattling the windows. The room fell into a comfortable silence. Not awkward, not hostile, just unfamiliar. For the first time in 3 years, there were no clients to impress, no co-workers to compete with, and no conference room table separating them. Only 2 men who had spent years pretending that every argument meant indifference, while quietly noticing far more about each other than either was willing to admit. Outside, the storm drew closer. Inside, the distance between them suddenly felt much smaller than the bed they were trying so hard to ignore. By the time dinner ended, the storm had swallowed the mountains. Rain drummed steadily against the lodge windows while employees gathered around the stone fireplace, trading stories and laughing over glasses of wine. Asher remained on the edge of the room, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Crowds exhausted him. They always had. Across the room, Kieran was exactly where everyone expected him to be, the center of every conversation. He had 3 designers laughing so hard they were wiping tears from their eyes, and even the agency's notoriously serious finance director had cracked a smile. Watching him should have been irritating. Instead, Asher found himself wondering if Kieran ever grew tired of pretending everything came so easily. "You've been staring at him for almost a minute." Asher nearly spilled his coffee. His teammate Mia grinned. "I wasn't." "Right." She leaned closer. "You know, Before you two started trying to outdo each other every week, you actually got along. The memory surfaced before Asher could stop it. 3 years earlier, their first day, the agency had paired them on a campaign for a struggling neighborhood bookstore. Asher arrived with spreadsheets, timelines, and carefully researched market data. Kieran walked in, carrying nothing but a notebook and a smile. "This won't work," Asher had said after hearing Kieran's first idea. Kieran had folded his arms. "Give me 1 hour." An hour later, he returned with a concept so unexpectedly brilliant that Asher spent the rest of the afternoon quietly refining it instead of arguing against it. They had won the client together. The celebration should have been simple. Instead, the creative director announced, "Looks like we've found ourselves a healthy rivalry." Everyone laughed. The label stuck. From that day on, every success belonged to one of them. Every mistake belonged to the other. Management constantly compared them. If only Asher had Kieran's charisma. If only Kieran had Asher's discipline. Neither man realized they had slowly begun measuring themselves through someone else's expectations. Yet even at the height of their rivalry, there were moments neither could explain. When Kieran's presentation software froze during a major pitch, Asher calmly fixed it without saying a word. When Asher worked through the night before a deadline, he would arrive the next morning to find a fresh coffee waiting on his desk. Neither ever admitted who had left it there. Neither said thank you. Some kindnesses lived best in silence. A burst of laughter pulled Asher back to the present. Kieran had looked across the room. Their eyes met. For a fleeting second, the noise around them disappeared. There was no challenge in Kieran's expression. Only warmth. Then someone called Kieran's name, and the moment dissolved as quickly as it had appeared. Outside, lightning flashed across the dark sky. The lodge manager hurried into the dining hall, his expression suddenly serious. "The storm has worsened," he announced. "Several trees have fallen across the only access road." A murmur spread through the room. "No one is leaving the mountain tonight." Asher glanced toward the windows. Somewhere deep in his chest, he had the strange feeling that the storm outside wasn't the one about to change everything. The lights went out without warning. One moment the lodge glowed with warm conversation and laughter. The next, darkness swallowed everything. A chorus of startled voices echoed through the building, before someone laughed nervously. Outside, thunder cracked so violently that the windows trembled. Emergency lights flickered for barely a second before dying completely. The lodge manager's voice carried through the darkness. "Everyone stay calm. Lightning hit the main power line. We've also lost phone service and internet. The roads are blocked, so repair crews can't reach us until morning." Groans filled the hallway. People reached instinctively for their phones, only to discover they were useless. Asher slipped quietly back toward the room. Kieran caught up beside him. "Looks like we're officially stranded. I noticed. You always answer with the fewest words possible?" "Only when I'm tired," Kieran smiled to himself. "So, all the time?" For the first time in years, Asher almost laughed. Inside their room, darkness wrapped around them like a heavy blanket. Only brief flashes of lightning spilling through the curtains revealed pieces of the room before disappearing again. Kieran found 2 emergency candles in a cabinet and lit them. Soft golden light replaced the harsh brightness they had grown used to. The room suddenly felt smaller, quieter, more honest, without laptops, without emails, without coworkers. There was nowhere left to hide behind work. They sat on opposite sides of the bed, leaving enough space between them to pretend the distance mattered. For several minutes, neither spoke. Then Kieran broke the silence. "Can I ask you something?" "You usually do. Why do you work so hard? Asher stared at the candle flame. When I was 16, my parents separated. His voice remained calm, but softer than Kieran had ever heard. My younger brother was 12. Someone had to make sure he finished school, that the bills were paid, that he believed life wasn't falling apart. You did all that? I tried. You never told anyone. There wasn't much to tell. Kieran looked at him for a long moment. You make taking care of people sound ordinary. It's what family does. The words lingered between them. Then Asher looked up. My turn. Kieran nodded. Everyone thinks you're confident. They're wrong. Another flash of lightning illuminated his face. They see someone who never gets nervous. He let out a quiet breath. The truth is, every room I walk into, I'm terrified people will realize I'm not enough. Asher frowned. You. I learned a long time ago that if I made people laugh first, they'd never notice how lonely I was. The admission hung in the silence. There was no performance now, no charming smile, only honesty. Another deafening crash of thunder shook the lodge. The windows rattled violently. Without thinking, Kieran reached out. His fingers found Asher's hand, warm, steady. For a heartbeat, Asher stiffened. Then instead of pulling away, his fingers slowly curled around Kieran's. Neither of them spoke. Neither needed to. In the quiet glow of two small candles, the rivalry they had carried for 3 years suddenly felt much less convincing than the comfort of simply holding on. Outside, the storm continued to rage. Inside, something far more dangerous had begun. Neither of them wanted to let go. The first thing Asher noticed was the sunlight. Thin streams of morning light slipped through the curtains, replacing the soft glow of the candles that had burned themselves out sometime before dawn. For a few peaceful seconds, he forgot where he was. Then he realized someone was still holding his hand. Kieran. Their fingers remained loosely intertwined between them, as though neither had moved for hours. Asher's breath caught. Carefully, almost reluctantly, he eased his hand away. The small movement was enough to wake Kieran. Their eyes met. Neither spoke. Neither mentioned what had happened during the storm. Instead, Kieran stretched and offered an awkward smile. Looks like the power came back. Looks like it. The simplicity of the conversation felt almost painful. Last night had stripped away 3 years of assumptions. Morning demanded they put them all back on again. They dressed in silence before making their way downstairs. The moment they entered the dining hall, every conversation seemed to pause. Then someone whistled. Well, look who survived the honeymoon suite. Laughter echoed across the room. Another coworker grinned. So, should we expect wedding invitations? Kieran forced a laugh. Disappointed to report nobody murdered anyone. The room erupted again. Asher managed a polite smile, but something inside him retreated. What had felt private only hours earlier was already becoming entertainment for everyone else. As they stepped outside after breakfast, one of the junior designers casually lifted a phone. A camera shutter clicked. Neither of them noticed. By the time the retreat ended that afternoon, the photo had already spread through the company's group chat. It showed Asher and Kieran walking side by side from the lodge, shoulders almost touching, both smiling at something neither could now remember. The captions appeared within minutes. Guess they settled their rivalry. One room really changes people. Didn't see this coming. Most comments were harmless. Some were less kind. By Monday morning, whispers greeted them before meetings did. People who had never cared about their personal lives suddenly watched every interaction. Every glance, every conversation, every shared elevator ride. Across the office, Department Director Travis Hollow silently scrolled through the messages on his phone. A slow smile spread across his face. He wasn't amused by the gossip. He was inspired by it. For the first time in years, someone had handed him the perfect opportunity to destroy a man he had been waiting to punish. Kieran had no idea the real storm was only beginning. Neither did Asher. The rumors spread faster than either of them could stop them. By Wednesday, conversations ended the moment Asher entered the break room. By Thursday, Kieran's largest client had been reassigned without explanation. On Friday, Asher received an email informing him that the leadership training program he had been nominated for was being postponed due to organizational restructuring. Nothing was ever stated outright. No one accused them of anything, but the message was unmistakable. They had become liabilities. Asher tried to ignore it. He buried himself in campaign reports and marketing forecasts, convincing himself the gossip would eventually burn itself out. Instead, it grew worse. One afternoon, he walked past human resources and overheard two managers speaking in hushed voices. Multiple anonymous complaints. Concerns about professionalism. Potential conflict of interest. Asher stopped walking. Conflict of interest. He and Kieran had never even confirmed the rumors people were inventing. Something wasn't right. That evening, he stayed long after everyone else had gone home. Using his operations access, he quietly reviewed the internal case numbers attached to the HR complaints. The dates didn't make sense. Several reports had supposedly been submitted before the mountain retreat had even happened. Another complaint claimed witnesses had observed behavior on a day when both he and Kieran had been meeting with clients in another city. Someone wasn't reporting events. Someone was manufacturing them. The more Asher searched, the clearer the pattern became. Every complaint targeted Kieran. He was always listed first. Asher's name only appeared because he happened to be standing beside him. His stomach tightened. This had never been about office gossip. Someone wanted Kieran gone. Hours later, while searching through archived email logs, Asher noticed something unusual. One message had been marked for deletion, but never fully removed from the company's backup server. Its sender information was still intact. His pulse quickened as he opened it. The recipient was Human Resources. The subject line read, Employee Conduct Review. At the bottom of the screen, one name appeared beneath the electronic signature. Travis Hollow. Asher stared at it in disbelief. The anonymous complaints had never been anonymous at all. Asher didn't sleep. The deleted email remained open on his laptop long after midnight, its single signature rewriting everything he thought he knew. Travis Hollow. The anonymous complaints had been fabricated from the very beginning. By sunrise, Asher had made a decision. If Travis had manipulated one report, he had probably manipulated dozens. He returned to the office before anyone else arrived. The building was unusually quiet, the fluorescent lights humming above nearly empty hallways. Using his authorized access to archived project files, Asher began following every trail Travis had tried to erase. It didn't take long. Expense reports had been quietly altered. Performance reviews had been edited after employees signed them. Meeting minutes had disappeared whenever someone questioned Travis's decisions. Then Asher found the oldest file, 3 years earlier. The same week, Kieran had presented an award-winning campaign that saved one of the agency's biggest accounts. Attached to the file was an internal audit. Kieran hadn't known it at the time, but his campaign expenses had exposed thousands of dollars in unauthorized departmental spending. The investigation had never moved forward. Someone in senior leadership had buried it. Travis hadn't forgotten. He had simply waited. Revenge, Asher realized, could be remarkably patient. Suddenly, everything made sense. The comparisons, the reassigned clients, the whispers, the fake complaints. None of it had anything to do with professionalism. Kieran had been marked years ago. Asher closed the folder, just as footsteps echoed outside his office. He quickly minimized the files. A moment later, Kieran appeared in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee. "I figured you skipped breakfast again." Asher accepted the cup. "Thank you." Kieran studied him for a moment. "You've been avoiding me. I've been trying to protect you." The words escaped before Asher could stop them. Kieran looked genuinely confused. "Protect me from what?" Asher wanted to tell him everything. About the emails, the fake complaints, the buried audit. Instead, he simply asked, "Do you trust me?" Without hesitation, Kieran answered, "More than anyone here." The certainty in his voice caught Asher off guard. For years he had believed they were rivals. Now standing only inches apart, he realized trust had quietly taken root beneath every disagreement they had ever shared. His gaze lingered for a heartbeat longer than it should have. So did Kieran's. Neither stepped away. Neither seemed to notice how close they had become, until another employee walked past the open door. The moment broke. Asher took a slow breath. "The leadership team is meeting tomorrow." "Morning." Kieran frowned. "Why does that sound like you're about to start a war?" Asher looked back at the files on his screen. "Because someone has to turn the lights on." The executive conference room had never felt so cold. Department heads filled both sides of the long glass table, whispering to one another as the leadership meeting began. Travis Hollow sat near the center, relaxed as always, greeting executives with the confidence of a man who believed he controlled the room. Then Asher walked in. He wasn't scheduled to attend. Every conversation stopped. "Asher," one vice president asked, "this meeting is for directors." "I know." His voice remained calm. "But what I have to say concerns every person in this company." Travis leaned back in his chair, wearing a patient smile. "This hardly seems appropriate." "No," Asher replied without taking his eyes off him. "What isn't appropriate is using anonymous complaints to settle personal grudges." The room fell silent. Asher connected his laptop to the projector. One by one, emails appeared on the screen. Timestamps, archived reports, deleted messages recovered from company backups, performance reviews that had been altered after submission. Then came the email bearing Travis's electronic signature, the same one that had started the campaign against Kieran. No one spoke. Several executives began scrolling through the evidence on the printed copies Asher had distributed before the meeting. Color drained from Travis's face. "Those documents are being taken out of context," he said quickly. "Then explain them," the CEO answered. Travis opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Asher continued. He explained how Kieran had unknowingly exposed financial irregularities years earlier, how the retaliation had been carefully disguised as workplace policy, how gossip had become a weapon because it left no fingerprints. Every sentence stripped away another layer of deception. For the first time since the rumors had begun, people weren't looking at Asher and Kieran with suspicion. They were looking at Travis. The meeting ended less than an hour later. Travis was escorted from the building pending a formal investigation. As employees watched through the office windows, whispers spread for an entirely different reason. This time the truth was louder than the gossip. When the hallway finally emptied, Kieran found Asher standing alone by the elevator. "You knew," he said softly. "I suspected. And you risked everything anyway." Asher looked down at the floor before meeting Kieran's eyes. "Some things are worth losing a career over." Kieran's expression softened. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Kieran asked the question that had been quietly waiting between them for years. "Why did you fight so hard for me?" Asher's lips parted, but no words came. Some truths were harder to say than exposing corruption, especially the ones hidden inside your own heart. The office felt strangely quiet in the days that followed. For once, people weren't whispering behind closed doors. They were apologizing. The executive team announced a formal investigation into Travis's conduct. Human Resources withdrew every anonymous complaint from Asher's and Kieran's personnel files. Promotions that had been frozen were reinstated, and clients were returned to the teams that had earned them. The company promised new policies, mandatory ethics training, independent reporting channels, protections against retaliation. It was everything employees had wanted to hear. Yet for Asher, none of it answered the one question that still mattered. Why had he found it so impossible to tell Kieran the truth? Late Friday evening, long after the office had emptied, Asher stood alone on the rooftop terrace overlooking the Chicago skyline. The city shimmered beneath the fading light, its noise softened by the distance. The door opened behind him. "I thought I'd find you here." Asher smiled without turning. "You always do." Kieran stepped beside him, resting his forearms on the railing. For several moments, they simply watched the traffic below. No presentations, no deadlines, no pretending. Finally, Kieran broke the silence. "You never answered my question." Asher let out a slow breath. "I know. Were you protecting me because we're friends?" "No. Because you felt responsible." Asher shook his head. Kieran turned to face him fully. "Then tell me." The words were gentle, not demanding, just honest. Asher laughed quietly, though there was no humor in it. "You know what the worst part of competing with you was?" Kieran frowned. "What?" "I stopped trying to beat you a long time ago." He looked into Kieran's eyes. "I just didn't know how to stop looking for you." The confession settled between them, fragile and terrifying. "I noticed you in every meeting." He smiled nervously. "I noticed when you skipped lunch because you were buried in work. I noticed when you laughed harder than everyone else, even on the days your smile didn't reach your eyes. I kept telling myself I was frustrated with you." His voice grew softer. "The truth was, I was afraid that if I admitted how much you mattered, I'd lose the only version of us I had." Kieran stared at him, his eyes bright with emotion. "You idiot!" Asher blinked. "For 3 years," Kieran continued with a shaky laugh, "I thought I was the only one trying not to fall in love with the person sitting across the conference table." They both laughed then, the sound quiet and relieved, as if something heavy had finally been lifted from both their shoulders. Kieran reached for Asher's hand. This time there was no storm, no darkness, no fear of who might see. Their fingers intertwined naturally. "I don't want to keep pretending," Kieran whispered. "You don't have to." Asher stepped closer, giving Kieran every chance to pull away. He didn't. Instead, Kieran closed the remaining distance between them and rested his forehead gently against Asher's. The city disappeared. For the first time in years, neither of them felt like rivals. They simply felt like home. A week later, an email arrived from the agency. Annual leadership retreat, Mountain Lodge reservation confirmed. Kieran looked up from his screen and smiled. "Looks like we're going back," Asher smiled back. "This time, let's make it our choice." Autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson when they returned to the lodge. A year had passed. So much had changed. The advertising agency had become a different place. Open-door policies replaced whispered gossip. Anonymous retaliation was no longer tolerated. Employees who once kept their heads down now spoke with a confidence that had been missing for years. Asher and Kieran had changed too, not overnight. Not because one confession had magically solved everything. Love, they had discovered, was less about dramatic moments and more about ordinary choices made every single day. Choosing breakfast together before work. choosing honesty over assumptions, choosing to listen instead of winning. When they stepped into the familiar lobby, the receptionist smiled warmly. "Welcome back, gentlemen." She glanced at the reservation before looking up. "I have you booked for 2 rooms." Kieran looked at Asher. The corners of Asher's mouth lifted into the same quiet smile Kieran had fallen in love with. "Actually," Kieran said, "we'd like 1 room." The receptionist smiled knowingly as she updated the reservation. "This time," she said, handing over the key card, "there's no booking mistake." Asher laughed. "I was hoping there wouldn't be." They rode the elevator together in comfortable silence. The room looked almost exactly the same. The wide window overlooked the mountains, the chair beside the fireplace, the small table where 2 untouched mugs of coffee had once grown cold during the storm. Even the king-sized bed stood in the center of the room, no longer a source of awkwardness, but a reminder of where everything had quietly begun. Kieran walked to the window. "Funny. What is? I spent years thinking that room trapped us." He turned toward Asher. "It actually set us free." Asher crossed the room until they stood only inches apart. It wasn't the room. No. It was finally seeing each other without all the noise. Kieran reached for his hand, just as he had on the night the power failed. Only now, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, no fear that morning would force them apart again. Outside, the evening sky darkened as distant thunder rolled gently through the mountains. Kieran smiled. "Think the power will go out again?" Asher slipped an arm around his waist. "I don't think we need the darkness anymore." Kieran leaned in, resting his forehead against Asher's with a contented sigh. "No," he whispered. "We found what the storm was trying to show us." As they stood together watching the first drops of rain touch the glass, Asher realized something that had taken him 3 years to understand. The person who challenged him the most had never been his rival. He had been the one person who refused to let him hide. Sometimes life has an unexpected way of placing 2 hearts in the same room, not to test whether they'll survive each other, but to discover whether they'll finally stop pretending they were ever meant to be apart. And perhaps the strongest relationships are not the ones that begin with perfect timing. They're the ones that begin when 2 guarded people decide that being vulnerable is no longer something to fear. Because when the lights first went out, they reached for each other's hands out of instinct. This time, they reached for each other by choice.